Hello there. We have got a busy story for you today, so I'm going to go ahead and get right into it. We are in the book of Second Samuel, starting in chapter 1. Now, you may be wondering, why is this book called Second Samuel when Samuel died in First Samuel well before it was over? Well, back when this was originally written down, Samuel 1 and 2 were both in the same book called Samuel, and somebody decided to split it up at some point. It doesn't change anything about the wording, it's just a different way of setting up the books so that I guess you can contain them into the time before David was king and then after David was king. And that's kind of where we are right now. Because if you remember from the last lesson, King Saul had just been killed in battle along with Jonathan and two of his other sons. So it appears at this point that Saul's kingdom has ended and it's time for David to move up and be the king that Samuel anointed him to be. And what we find is that David is with his men in Ziklag, which is in the Philistine territory. Now, this is not a surprise because, of course, you remember in this that he had been working for one of the Philistine kings and was planning to go into battle, but the other Philistines did not trust David, and probably with good reason. So David was busy doing other things, and he's in Ziklag when he gets word from an Amalekite who shows up that Saul and Jonathan are dead. And he investigates this, and the Amalekite says that, oh yeah, I was there. I saw what had happened. Saul was wounded. He was going to die, and he asked me to kill him. So I did, and I brought his crown and his armband to you. And David has this evidence, and so he's now certain that Saul is dead, and he and his men mourn for Saul. Not quite the reaction that the Amalekite might have expected, because this was a clear shot for David to become the outright and acknowledged king of Israel. And finally, David turns to the Amalekite and says, why did you think it was okay to kill God's anointed? Uh-oh, the Amalekite's in trouble. And sure enough, he is killed by one of David's men for having the nerve to claim to have killed Saul. Well, from what we had learned at the end of 1 Samuel, Saul had actually fallen on his own sword. So most likely what was happening was this Amalekite came along. He may have even been a looter, the kind of person who would come and find the dead bodies and take valuable things from them. He finds Saul's body, takes the crown and the armband, which were the symbols of his office, and thinks, oh, I can get in good with David, because he knows just enough about David to think that, okay, David's going to be the next guy in charge, and I'll be rewarded handsomely for providing David this information. And he thinks that by saying that he finished off Saul, then his reward will be even greater. Well, David's not that kind of a guy. He's one who had the chance to have killed Saul and didn't do it. So the Amalekite greatly messed up in doing this. Well, David now consults with God through the priest who is with him and says, should I go back into Judah? And God says, yes. David goes back to Judah. Of course, that's the tribal area he comes from, and the people there welcome him, and the leaders of Judah come to him and anoint him king. Well, this makes the second time David's been anointed. Of course, the first time by Samuel. Now Judah has anointed him as their king. Whether or not the rest of Israel will go along with it, they're saying, this is our guy. Meanwhile, we look back to see what has happened as a result of Saul dying. Well, one of his sons was not involved in the battle. This is Ishbosheth. He's about 40 years old at the time. Don't know why he was not with them. Maybe he just wasn't a good fighter, or maybe he was to run things while Saul was gone. In any event, he's still alive, and the head general of the army of Israel, Abner, is still alive, and he essentially says, okay, Ishbosheth is the king of Israel now because he's the son of the king who has just died. And in that sense, usually when the king dies, the oldest son becomes the next king. Well, he's the oldest remaining son, and so he becomes the king, and he's king for a couple of years. And there's fighting between David's people and Ishbosheth's people. And in this sense, David does not recognize Ishbosheth as the king as he had with Saul, because Ishbosheth has not been anointed, uh, at least not anointed by God or through God's intervention. So there's this fighting going on, but what happens to Ishbosheth is that he is napping during midday, and a couple of guys go in and kill him. And then they take along proof that they've killed him, and they go to David and says, okay, this guy's dead now, you're the king. And David just kind of looks at him and says, you know, some time back when Saul died, somebody came to me and said that Saul was dead, and this person thought he would get in my good graces, and now you're doing the same thing. So the same thing that happened to that guy is going to happen to you for killing an innocent man. And he has them executed. You see, David may have been fighting against Ishbosheth, but it was not his intention to kill the man. In fact, most likely the fighting that was going on was with Ishbosheth wanting to hang on to what he had. During this time, Abner gets killed as well. So there is nothing standing in the way of David becoming king, and Israel meets and anoints David as king. Well, David just doesn't sit back at this time. He wants to take Jerusalem. This is one city that's been held by the Jebusites for years and years and years, even before the Israelites started moving into the promised land. And Jerusalem is in the promised land, so this is supposed to be their territory as well. Well, David leads his troops in. He has his commander, and they take Jerusalem, which is an amazing thing. And David all this time is giving God the credit. He knows God is helping him and his army to achieve these great things. So now the Philistines, who probably had been looking at David as neutral, if not actually kind of friendly to them for past actions, now start seeing that David could be a threat to them, and they take their armies and they send them after David to fight him. Well, David ends up having a couple of battles with the Philistines and defeats them soundly, sending the Philistines back to their territory. And we don't hear much from the Philistines for a long time after this. They have decided to leave this guy alone, and they're not going to cause any more trouble. Well, David now has Jerusalem. He wants to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem because they finally have the city. And the planning for this is not done real well because the rules for how the ark is to be moved are not followed. They use a special cart and they put the Ark of the Covenant on it and they send it toward Jerusalem. Well, the oxen pulling the cart stumble, the ark starts to fall, and this one man puts his hand up to keep the ark from falling off the cart. Well, he's immediately struck dead by God because God had given a rule a long time ago: do not touch the ark. It's only to be touched by the priest during the performance of their duties. Okay, well, David is angry, and from what I read, we're not sure why he's angry. I've always heard it said that he was angry at God for killing this man who was trying to do something that we think of as good. But I wonder, too, if maybe it's something else. Maybe David is angry at himself because he did not follow the rules of how the ark was to be moved, and in the sense, he's responsible for the man dying. Well, in any event, David decides, okay, we're not bringing the ark into Jerusalem because God's already angry and we don't want to bring down any problems from God onto Jerusalem, and they leave it at this fellow's house. Well, for the next 3 months, this man is blessed by having the ark there, and David sees that, okay, things with God are okay. It's okay to bring the ark into the city. Well, they do that, and that's a great celebration. David is seeing some good things coming as a result of his being king. There is a king in Lebanon who sends him a lot of cedar wood, and David uses that to build a palace, and he's wanting to build a temple, but God will not let him. Actually, this is where we find the first mention of Nathan being a prophet working with David pretty regularly. We don't know where Nathan came from, but he is with David at this time. And at first, Nathan says, sounds like a good idea to build a temple. But then later, God says, no, it's not for David to do. And Nathan goes back and tells David. There is one other thing that happens. The kings to the east start picking fights with Israel, and David is able to defeat them soundly as well. So as we close on this part of the story, and this is through chapter 10 of 2 Samuel, David has defeated enemies on all sides. He has some alliances with other people, and things look really well for Israel, and it's all because of God, and David acknowledges that, and because he is trying to do what God wants him to do. So everything is real good at this point, and we will close there with the thought that as long as you put God first in your life and try to do what he wants you to do, you will see blessings come from that. Okay, today's tie, I just picked the Star Wars tie because, one, it has to do with war, and that's a lot of what was going on in these chapters. And the other is you kind of think of David here. It's the main guy, and there are opponents and there are friends in all of this. So with that, I will let you go, and I hope you'll be back next time. Bye.